Alright, so we have a slightly different video today, just trying something a little different. We wanted to talk a little bit about Aristotle this week, and we're going to look at three specific sections with regards to him. First off, there is another video that you're going to look at that deals with his ethics. He is considered to be the father of Western ethics in many ways. There's a biography of him as part of that video, so I'm not going to go into that here. But what I am going to look at in this one is Aristotle's logic, as well as his take on the theory of the forms. So Aristotle's logic is very important. Logic, as you know, is one of the key tools of philosophy. It's what allows us to evaluate arguments and decide whether they are valuable for usage or not. And Aristotle is really the creator of that formal system of logic. Prior to Aristotle, we had what we might call critical thinking, but a formalized structure or system of logic we did not have. The logic that Aristotle creates is called categorical logic. It is called categorical logic largely because all of the statements that we use in this form of logic fit into four basic categories of statements. We have what's called a universal affirmative statement, which would be all A or B. We have a universal negative statement, which would be no A or B. We have a particular affirmative, which would be some A or B. And we have a particular negative, which is some A or not B. And so because we have these four basic categories of statements, we have categorical logic. This is not a logic class, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that. Just essentially to let you know that that was the first form of logic that was created. There have been others since then. But Aristotle does establish a couple of very important principles for us. One of these is what's called the principle of bivalence. Every statement must have a truth value, and that value is either true or false. The term bivalence, bi means two, valent means truth, and so every statement in logic depends upon the fact that it has a truth value. And there are no other options. It's either true or it is false, one or the other. The principle of bivalence is very important to logic, not just categorical logic, but also later logics that come along. Aristotle is also going to give us another precedent here, which is the existential assumption. The existential assumption is to speak logically about anything, at least one of that thing must exist. So we can't talk about empty classes of things. We can only concern ourselves with what is real. We can only concern ourselves with what exists. The reason for that, I think, kind of is obvious. It goes back to the principle of bivalence. If I talk about something that doesn't exist, then how can I assign a truth value to it? A very famous example was given to us by Bertrand Russell, who said, take the statement, the present king of France is bald. Now, according to the principle of bivalence, to use that statement in logic, it needs to have a truth value. But there is no king of France. France is a republic. It has a president, not a king. And so how can we assign a truth value to it? If, on the other hand, we said the present king of England is bald, then there's an actual person we can look at. We can verify that he has hair. We can decide that that statement is false, okay? Because there's an actual being to assign it to. But when you're dealing with someone who doesn't actually exist, this becomes essentially impossible. So in logic, we can only talk about things that are real. At least one of that thing, whatever it is, has to exist. Now, this principle of bivalence, as I said, is very important to logic, but we do run into a little bit of a problem. Because this works fine when we're dealing with the present. If I say that there is snow on the ground outside, I can look out there and verify it. If I say that that this room has 50 chairs in it. I can look at that and verify that fact. But that's all I can do. I can't do anything more than that. But that's okay. That's all I need to do. Because I know, because it's happening now in front of me in the present, that the statement is either true or false. The same goes with the past. If I want to say the first president of the United States was Richard Nixon, then I can very easily verify that and discover that statement is false. So the past and the present are not a problem with regards to the principle of bivalence, but the future is. And Aristotle points this out to us. There is a problem, actually there's two problems that he's going to point out with regards to the principle of bivalence. The first one is not really a major issue, but it's when a statement is making a self-reference. We have statements that are called self-reflexive indexicles. And because these statements refer to themselves, it really doesn't have a proper truth value. So for example, we see the starred sentence is false. Right there's the star, so this is the starred sentence. So let's say that we want to assign a truth value to that statement. It is true that the starred sentence is false. Well, since that's the starred sentence, that means it must be false. So it's false that the starred sentence is false. Well, that means it must be true. Okay, it contradicts itself. Similarly, we see this shirt that was put out by the American Philosophical Association a few years ago. It says on the front that the statement on the back of the shirt is false. So this statement is false, which says the statement on the front of the shirt is true. So if this statement is true, or rather if the statement is false, then that means that the statement being made there is not true, it must be false. So the statement on the back of the shirt is false, which means that it must be true. But that tells me the statement on the front of the shirt is true, which means that that is false, and on and on. This is something that is fun to baffle your friends with over a few drinks, but it's not a serious problem in the history of logic. Aristotle largely glosses over it. But what is a major problem, as I said, is that question of future events. Aristotle is going to be responsible for dealing with this in a work called On Interpretation, specifically chapter 9 of On Interpretation. And he lays out the basic problem through what we now call the sea battle scenario. And I've gone ahead and put this into a nice logical structure to help us understand it. The basic idea is simple. Someone says, there will be a sea battle tomorrow. The problem, of course, is that according to the principle of bivalence, that statement either has to be true or it has to be false. Either there will be a sea battle tomorrow or there will not be a sea battle tomorrow. But my statement, as soon as I say it, according to the principle of bivalence, must have a truth value. So how can there be one when the future hasn't occurred yet? And so we see our first premise here says either it is true now that there will be a sea battle tomorrow, or it is false now that there will be a sea battle tomorrow. That's simply laying out the basic issue with regards to the principle of bivalence. Either the statement there will be a sea battle tomorrow is true, or it is false. Now, here's where the problem is. If it's true now that there will be a sea battle tomorrow, then it's necessary there will be a sea battle tomorrow. And likewise, the third premise, if it's false now that there will be a sea battle tomorrow, then it's necessary that there will not be a sea battle tomorrow. This means that if that statement is right now either true or false, that the future is already written. It's already established. And hence we have fallen victim to the idea of fate, that we have no control over the future, that it's already there. And that's the conclusion that ends up getting drawn, that either it is necessary that there will be a sea battle tomorrow, or it is necessary that there will not be a sea battle tomorrow. So one of these two states of affairs is absolutely necessary based upon the truth value that is assigned. Now, this, again, for a lot of people in the ancient world might not have been a problem because there were a lot of people that believed in the concept of fate. But Aristotle was not one of them. He believed in causality. He believed that our actions controlled what the future was going to look like. But he did not believe that fate dictated in any way the future. And so, how can it be that we know that this statement is true, or that we know that this statement is false, which again is what the principle of bivalence demands, until these events occur? Well, Aristotle's solution to this is relatively simple, although nobody really picked up on it and worked with it until about 1920, 2,200 years or so after the time of Aristotle. People tried to find other solutions to this problem, but Aristotle's solution is very simple. When it comes to the past or to the future, we are not able to apply the principle of bivalence. We need essentially a three-valued system of logic, what we might call a trivalent system, so that in addition to the true and the false, we also have an undetermined possibility. And so, when I make a statement about the future, there will be a sea battle tomorrow. Right now, that statement has a truth value of undetermined. Very simple, undetermined. Now, tomorrow, if there is a sea battle, then in hindsight, we can go back and say, well, my statement turned out to be true. And likewise, tomorrow, if there is not a sea battle, then we can say, obviously, that the statement turned out to be false. But we don't know that until the event occurs. And so while we know that these statements that are being made about the future will eventually be proven true or false, because there are only two options, the fact is that until tomorrow comes, or until the date of that event comes, we have no way of knowing this for sure. And so the future is unwritten, but the principle of bivalence is still essentially true. It's just that we need that initial claim of undeterminance in order to get to that point. Because right now, a statement about the future will eventually be true or false, but it's not yet, so it's undetermined. Now, that first system of trivalent logic was actually created in 1920 based upon Aristotle's suggestion, but it was created in 1920 by a Polish logician called Jan Lukasiewicz. And Jan Lukasiewicz really started the first of what would become many, many different multi-valued theories of logic. But again, it all ultimately begins with Aristotle. So that's really all I had to say with regards to the issue of logic. But I wanted to turn to this question of the theory of the forms. We remember from Plato that the ancient Greeks believed that knowledge had to be knowledge of something that was absolute and unchanging. These forms, such as the form of justice or the form of humanness, or what have you. Well, Aristotle is also going to accept that knowledge has to be knowledge of something that's absolute and unchanging. However, what Aristotle doesn't accept is this idea that there's two realms of existence, the realm of being and the realm of becoming that Plato talks about. For Aristotle, this world is what there is. He's very pragmatic, he's very practical in his approach. And so, while the forms are real, they do not dwell in some other world. The stuff that's here in this world is not simply a poor copy trying to emulate that perfect form, but rather it dwells inside of the object itself. And so there is, in essence, a joining together of the material, physical, changing thing of this world with the perfect ultimate form of what that thing is. And so Aristotle is basically going to explain to us that when we look at any given thing, and let's take, for example, an acorn, that acorn is a specific configuration of form and matter. Okay? The form that makes it what it is, that gives it its shape, its color, its texture. The form for Aristotle is very much like a DNA molecule would be for our modern world. It tells it what it's going to look like, what it's going to feel like, what color it's going to be, how it's going to grow. It dictates all aspects of its existence. And the matter, of course, is the changing thing that makes it what it is. Now we know that this acorn has the potential to become an oak tree. And this oak tree is a very different configuration of form and matter than the acorn. But yet, he says we also know that there's not a moment when this disappears and this comes into being. Instead, there's a metamorphosis that takes place. There's a shifting or a changing that's going to take place from the one to the other. And so there has to be something that underlies it. There has to be something that remains consistent throughout. Now, obviously, the form of an acorn is very different from the form of an oak tree. So what is going to remain consistent throughout is matter. The same material that's found in that acorn is also going to be found in the oak tree. And so there is this transformation that takes place. Obviously, more matter is going to grow, more is going to come into it, but the same matter that was here is going to be found in that. It's just that there's a different form acting upon it to make it what it is. And so we find that the acorn has the potential to grow into an oak tree. And so that oak tree is an actualization of that potential. But that oak tree also has further potential. It has the ability to produce more acorns, which can produce more oak trees, and on and on and on from there. Now the question that Aristotle raises next is, why is it doing this? What is it that is the cause to make us want to maximize the potential, to make it actual? And he says that inside of every living entity, there is this little thing that he calls a love or a desire. And it is that desire to maximize its potential, because potential implies change. And as we learned, the only reason why there should be change is because there's something wrong that has to be fixed. And so we can't have that. We want to get rid of that potential. We want to maximize it to make it actual. But of course, since the actual, in this world at least, produces further potential, we're never completely going to get to that point. But nonetheless, we are moving that way because of that love or that desire that dwells within it. But then the question becomes, well, what is it that brings this form and matter together in the first place? And Aristotle talks about these beings that he calls movers. He doesn't explain them very well, but essentially in the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas is going to build with Aristotle's view here, and he's going to refer to the movers as angels. And so they're beings that are not completely divine, they're not completely human, they're somewhere in between. But the movers are ultimately responsible for the forms. And so there's lots of these movers. And each mover has a different form. There's one that has the form of acorn, there's one that has the form of oak tree, there's one that has the form of human, there's one that has the form of cat, whatever. And because they have that form, they have a desire also to maximize, to create. And so they're going to push that form onto what's called prime matter. Prime matter is the ultimate building block of the universe. It's everything that is. Prime matter is pure potential. There is no actualization within it at all. It is pure potential to become anything and everything. But as yet, until form is acted upon it, it's nothing. But this mover is going to take that form and put it onto the prime matter, join them together, and produce, create the first of whatever this thing is, in this case an acorn, that exists in the world. And that's how things are brought into being, and why we see the matter and the form being joined together. Because of course, once the form is added to the prime matter is transformed into matter in the sense that we understand it as flesh and bone, as wood, as steel, as whatever that entity happens to be. But then we're left with one more question. Why does the mover do this? What is it that's making the mover do this? And so Aristotle says, well, we have this other being that we call the prime mover. The prime mover is the direct opposite of prime matter. It is pure actuality. Okay. Prime mover, pure actuality. There is no potential within it, which means that it is ultimate, that it is absolute, that it is perfection. Not surprisingly, when Thomas Aquinas equates movers to angels, he equates the prime mover to God. And sort of gives us a Christianized take on Aristotle's view here. But in essence, we can also see that we're still not all that far removed from the views of Heraclitus, because once again, we have this sense of the opposites coming into play: the pure potential, the pure actuality, the prime matter, the prime mover. Now, the thing about the prime mover is that perfection can know nothing other than perfection. It has no other knowledge or existence of itself. So perfection can only know other perfection, which means that all the prime mover can really do is sit in contemplation of itself. It can't know anything else that's beyond it. But yet it is there. And because it's there, these movers recognize that there is this perfect state. And they know that as long as that potential of the form is within them, that they're not going to attain that state of perfection. And so, in their desire to attain perfection, the mover is going to push the form onto the prime matter to create this thing in the world and get it started. And so we can see the prime mover then as being the first cause, the beginning of all things. We also, of course, see that that same mentality is there because the mover wants to maximize its potential so that it can join with, be absorbed into the prime mover. But the things that exist in this world also have that love or that desire within them that is pulling them forward. But what is it that's pulling them? Well, in essence, it's still the prime mover. So just as we showed the prime mover as the beginning, as the first cause, we could also place the prime mover down here at the end, because it's what's driving, propelling, pulling everything towards it to try to maximize its potential to become everything that it is capable of being. There is that sense as well. So again, you can kind of see where this would appeal to a Christian writer like Thomas Aquinas. If we equate the prime mover to God, then God is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, right? Everything in between. But in essence, this is his view on the theory of the forms. So while it is grounded in this world rather than two separate realms of existence, we still have the idea of absolute perfection. We still have the idea of change and metamorphosis. We still have those two concepts. We still have the idea that real knowledge is knowledge of something that's absolute and unchanging. And we have the notion of the opposites, as we saw as well. So there's a lot to be said about the shared beliefs of Plato and Aristotle. Essentially, the distinction the medievals are going to make is to say that Plato is an extreme realist because he finds that that perfect form is somewhere else and that this world is just simply trying to copy it. Aristotle, on the other hand, they say is a moderate realist, which would imply that he's moderate in the sense that there is this perfect state, but that perfect form is inside of what the thing is. It gives it its form, its structure, its shape, again, much like that DNA molecule of our modern world. And so Aristotle, in his scientific fashion, said that we could effectively come to analyze any given thing and come to know it through what he refers to as the four causes. The four causes are formal, final, material, and efficient. Formal, final, material, and efficient. Those are your four basic causes. And so we can analyze any given thing based upon that. The formal cause is, as the name implies, simply the form that dwells within it, that makes it what it is. Final is also referred to as the teleological cause, the end cause. What's its purpose? What's its function? The material cause is, again, as the name implies, the matter that it's made up of. It's wood, it's sap, it's bone, whatever. And then the efficient cause is the entity or the being that created it. So if you took a chair as an example, the formal cause would be that form of chairness that dwells within it. The final cause would be utility. It's there to be useful as something to sit upon. It's material. Well, in the case of the chairs in this room, it's made of plastic, maybe a little bit of metal. Other chairs might be made of wood, but whatever the material is. And then the efficient cause, the creator, is whatever craftsman or individual put all of those parts together, the seat, the back, the legs, and so on, and build it. Now, if you take that question, though, of efficient cause even further, then we could say, what is the efficient cause of that craftsman? It's its parents. Well, what's the efficient cause of them? Their parents, and so on, and so on, and so on. But Aristotle would tell us that we can't have this infinite regression just keep going back and back and back. There has to be a starting point. There has to be a first cause. And so ultimately, if we follow it back, to the very first individual, whether that be Adam or whether that be Mana or whether that be whoever, we take that first entity as being, by Aristotle's understanding, before them was the mover that put the form of humanness onto the matter that transformed into bone and flesh and blood and so on, and brought that being into existence. But even before that is that perfect eternal entity, that one that has always existed and always will, the one that doesn't have a starting point, and that's the prime mover. And so ultimately, the prime mover is the efficient cause of everything. Even though, ironically, the prime mover doesn't actually move. It is pulling entities towards it by attraction. But in essence, that is Plato's view of the theory of the forms. Earlier we looked at that's Aristotle's theory of the forms. And earlier we looked a little bit at Aristotle's logic. And as I said at the outset, there is another video, which deals with his ethics. And those are the three aspects of Aristotle that you will be required to be familiar with for this class. All right?